On a deserted stretch of Highway 42 in Kansas, where snow blanketed the world in a silence so thick it could choke out even memory, a small, worn-down diner stood like a relic from another time. Highway Haven Café, once a lively stop for truckers and travelers, now sat mostly in shadows, its neon sign flickering weakly against the storm. Inside, James Carter, a 45-year-old former trucker, stood behind the counter. His broad shoulders were hunched beneath a faded flannel jacket, his hands moving with the slow precision of a man who knew every inch of his empty kingdom. His face, lined with years and grief, barely reacted to the wind that howled just outside the windows. Since losing his wife, Laura, the cafe had become less of a business and more of a sanctuary for his memories, though even those were beginning to slip beneath the snowdrifts of time. James glanced at the clock. 10 minutes to close. The drawer at the register held just enough cash to remind him how far behind the bills had gotten. The heating system groaned with fatigue, and the pantry in the back was nearly empty. Still, he hadn't flipped the close sign yet. Something in him resisted. Laura used to call him her oak tree, steady, stubborn, unyielding. He could still hear her voice when the silence grew too loud, reminding him that sometimes you held on, not because you had anything left, but because someone once believed in you enough to ask you to. And so he stayed, wiping down the already clean counter for the 5th time, lost in a loop of habit that barely held the edges of his life together. Then the bell above the front door jingled, a sound so sharp it cut through the haze in James's head. He looked up, surprised. The man who entered was nearly swallowed by snow, his trucker's cap and thick navy coat dusted white, his cheeks flushed red from the cold. He stood in the doorway, blinking as if unsure he'd found the right place, then stepped inside and pulled the door shut behind him. The storm outside wailed louder, as though angry at losing one of its own. James took in the man's posture, tired and more worn than he let on. The stranger's voice cracked the quiet like a branch under snow evening. "Any chance you're still serving?" James hesitated. His first instinct was to say no, to say the kitchen was closed, the food was gone, and the night was already claimed by ghosts. But something about the man's eyes, some blend of exhaustion and unspoken hope, stopped him. Maybe it was the way he stood, like someone used to rejection. Maybe it was how familiar that weight on his shoulders looked. James nodded slowly. Coffee's still hot kitchens open for a few more minutes. "Take a seat anywhere." The stranger's lips curved into a grateful smile, small, almost uncertain, as he moved toward the counter, leaving a trail of melting snow behind him like ghost footprints. James poured the coffee without being asked, the smell wrapping around them like a blanket. The man sat down, cupping the mug in his hands, like it was the most precious thing in the world. Outside, the blizzard raged with renewed force, battering the windows, howling against the eaves, trying to claw its way inside. But for the moment, the warmth of Highway Haven Café held it at bay. James watched the steam rise from the cup and felt something stir deep in his chest, a flicker of purpose maybe, or just the faint memory of what it used to feel like to serve someone who needed you. Just as James was about to retreat to his thoughts, the door opened again. 2 more figures stumbled in, shaking off snow and blinking against the sudden light. They looked around as if unsure whether to believe what they saw, a glowing cafe heat still humming, the smell of coffee in the air. One of them looked at James with raw hope in his eyes. "Any chance you've got more coffee, sir?" he asked. James didn't speak. He just gestured to the counter and nodded, and then the door opened again and again. Within minutes, half the booths were filled with truckers, some young, some grizzled, all of them carrying that same look of desperation wrapped in layers of frost. And just like that, the night changed. James Carter, who had been preparing to close up for good, found himself at the center of something he didn't expect, a beacon for the road. Weary, he moved without thought, pouring coffee, firing up the grill, answering questions with quiet nods. He didn't know what tomorrow held. He didn't know how long the supplies would last, but tonight he wasn't alone, and neither were they. As the wind screamed inside Highway Haven Cafe, a long-forgotten warmth began to return. 1 cup of coffee at a time, the storm outside showed no signs of slowing. If anything, it grew more aggressive, sending gusts of wind so fierce they made the windows tremble and the old neon sign outside sway like a ship in distress. James Carter barely had time to process the arrival of the first few truckers before the bell above the diner's door rang again and again. One by one, more drivers pushed their way into Highway Haven Café, their coats thick with snow faces raw from the biting wind and eyes heavy with miles. Some entered quietly, others stumbled in like men pulled from wreckage. James didn't ask questions. He simply motioned to open booths, poured coffee, and kept the grill hot. The cafe, once a hollow place of silence and faded memories, began to stir with life again. Each arrival, a heartbeat, reviving its pulse. Soon, every booth was occupied. The counter filled with hunched figures, nursing steaming mugs, grateful just to feel warmth in their hands. The men spoke in low tones, like they didn't want to disturb the fragile shelter they'd found. James moved behind the counter with a quiet urgency, reaching deep into muscle memory to flip pancakes, butter toast, and press burgers onto the griddle. He hadn't cooked this much food at once in months, maybe years, but it came back to him easily like a forgotten melody. Just as he was about to drop another batch of eggs onto the skillet, the back door creaked open, and in came Lindsay, his part-time waitress, bundled in 3 layers and pink-cheeked from the cold. "Told you not to come in tonight," James muttered without looking up. She shrugged already, tying on her apron. "And I told you I don't listen to bad advice without needing instructions." Lindsay darted from booth to booth, refilling mugs, handing out menus, offering gentle smiles that cut through the weariness hanging in the air. In the kitchen, she rummaged through the freezer and pantry, giving James a quiet inventory of what little they had left. Some frozen chicken wings, a few bags of pancake, mix a half bag of potatoes, and a few dusty cans of chili. It wasn't much. Certainly not enough to sustain this many people if the highway stayed closed another night, but neither of them spoke about running out. They just worked. James grilled, Lindsay plated. Together they moved like a well-worn team, fighting back the dark with nothing but food, coffee, and grit. One young driver, no more than 23, hesitated at the door, peeking inside with uncertainty before finally stepping in. His lips were blue from the cold, his hands trembling as he tried to rub life back into them. "Is it okay if I stay here for a bit?" he asked, eyes darting between the crowded booths. James pointed to an empty stool at the counter and nodded. "You're here now. That's all that matters." The boy sank into the seat with a relieved sigh, and James poured him a cup without another word. It was the same with each new arrival. No questions, no judgment, just hot food, warm lights, and the unspoken promise of safety. As the hours passed and the wind howled like a creature outside, James began to feel the weight of his choices. The electricity bill sat unpaid in the drawer beneath the register. The mortgage notice loomed unread but unforgettable. The heating system groaned in protest under the strain of keeping so many bodies warm. But despite all that, James never once considered turning anyone away. This wasn't about profit. It never had been. Laura used to say that Highway Haven was more than a diner. It was a place where people found each other when the road got too long. It was a lighthouse, a safe harbor. James had forgotten that for a while, buried under debt and grief. But tonight, with truckers packed shoulder to shoulder inside his cafe, the truth burned in his chest again like fire. Just before midnight, Lindsay leaned on the counter beside James, her arms crossed and a smudge of flour on her cheek. "We're gonna run out," she whispered. James didn't reply right away. He just looked out over the room at the faces of men thawing under soft lights and the hum of the heater, at the sound of forks scraping plates and coffee being poured. And he smiled, small, weary, but real. "Then we make it stretch," he said. "We find a way. We always have." And with that, he turned back to the grill, dropping another handful of hash browns onto the sizzle and smoke. Outside the storm raged, but inside Highway Haven Café, James Carter held the line, not just against winter, but against the loneliness that had nearly buried him. This diner was still standing, and tonight that mattered more than anything. The blizzard outside refused to let up. Wind screamed like a wounded beast across the plains, slamming into the diner's old windows with icy fists. But inside Highway Haven Café, the warmth of food, coffee, and company had created a quiet miracle. The hum of conversation slowly replaced the silence that had once dominated the room. At first, the truckers kept to themselves, hunched over plates, grateful just to be somewhere dry and warm. But then, slowly like frost melting off a windshield, the room began to soften. One man offered a chuckle over a joke, another shared a quick tale of a close call on a mountain pass, and just like that, stories began to flow, rough-edged, half-told but real. The kind of stories only men who lived life in miles and fuel gauges could understand. James Carter worked the grill with the ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times, but his ears stayed tuned to the room. He heard the tale of a driver whose brakes gave out near Black Mountain, the time a trucker traded half a tank of diesel for a stale sandwich, and warm seat the night one man got snowed in at a closed gas station for 36 hours with nothing but a bag of pretzels. Laughter came easy now, low and worn like the boots on their feet. It wasn't the boisterous laughter of parties or celebration. It was the kind of laughter that rises between men who've seen the same long nights, survived the same narrow escapes, and know that just being here is worth something. The cafe, once a tomb for James's memories, was suddenly alive again, its walls echoing with voices that didn't belong to ghosts. It was Caleb, the youngest among them, who finally asked the question. He was seated at the far end of the counter, nervously stirring sugar into his coffee. "You ever drive long haul, sir?" he asked, his voice tentative but curious. The room quieted a little. James looked up, a small smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. He nodded slowly. "Used to," he said. "Long time ago." That was all he offered, but it was enough. Something shifted in the room. Sam, the first driver to arrive that night, turned on his stool to face James more directly. "Wait," he said, eyes narrowing. "You wouldn't be Carter, would you?" Jim Carter drove that old blue Kenworth with the chrome stacks. James gave a quiet nod. "That's me," he said. The silence that followed wasn't from shock, it was from recognition. One by one, heads began to turn. Men looked at each other, exchanged glances, and then the story started again. But this time, they were about James. One man remembered breaking down outside Tulsa and how a stranger in a blue rig had helped him patch a busted radiator in the rain. Another swore James had guided him by CB through an ice storm in the Rockies when visibility dropped to 0. "That was you," he said, wide-eyed. "You kept me calm when I thought I was going off that cliff." A woman seated near the jukebox, her hands calloused from years on the road, recalled a soft, calm voice over the radio that talked her through a dark pass in Wyoming when her GPS failed. "Didn't realize until now," she said, blinking fast. "That was you too." James stood frozen for a moment, the spatula still in his hand. He didn't know what to say. He had never considered himself a hero, just someone who knew what it felt like to be out there alone, to be stranded with no one coming. And so he had answered calls when he could, pulled over when others drove by, lent spare parts, shared food, and made room on the airwaves for frightened voices. Now, hearing those moments spoken aloud, pieced together from memories scattered across states and years, James felt something in him thaw, something long buried under grief and quiet. He hadn't realized that what he had given all those years ago still echoed down the line. The stories continued. Someone passed around an old photo they found pinned near the register. James and Laura smiling beside the blue Kenworth, standing in front of a younger, busier Highway Haven. It was faded and yellowed with time, but the feeling in it was clear. A legacy. Something worth remembering. The room grew quiet as the photo made its way down the line. James watched it move from hand to hand, each man holding it with a strange kind of reverence. For the first time in years, he felt seen, not just as the man behind the counter, but as someone who had once mattered out there, and maybe still did. Caleb returned the photo gently to the wall, looking at James with quiet admiration. That night, As the wind shrieked and snow piled higher against the doors, the cafe became more than a refuge. It became a reunion, not of names and faces, but of a code, a brotherhood, a bond built not by contracts or uniforms, but by cold nights, engine failures, shared radios, and the unspoken promise that when one of your own was in trouble, you didn't look away. James Carter, once just a man trying to survive one more day, stood surrounded by the living proof that the road had not forgotten him, and in return he remembered who he was. Not a man lost to grief, not a diner owner counting down to foreclosure, but a driver, a brother, and someone who, when it mattered most, kept the light on. As the first light of dawn filtered through the frost-covered windows, the storm finally began to lose its grip. The howling wind had faded into a ghost of itself, and the snow, once violent and blinding, now fell in lazy spirals like feathers from a torn pillow. Inside Highway Haven Café, the dozen truckers who had found shelter there still lingered in booths and at the counter, some dozing with heads resting on folded arms, others quietly sipping coffee, their conversations hushed by the sacred stillness of survival. James Carter leaned against the far wall, arms crossed his body, aching from the long night, but his heart full in a way it hadn't been in years. He watched as Lindsay moved between tables, clearing plates and refilling mugs with a calm that belied her exhaustion. The warmth in the room was no longer just from the heat it radiated from shared experience, from human decency rediscovered in the heart of a storm. Then came the rumble, low and steady, like thunder still a long way off. At first, James thought he was imagining it, a phantom sound conjured by his tired mind. But then one of the drivers closest to the window straightened, rubbed the fog from the glass and blinked. "You guys hear that?" he muttered. More heads turned. James moved to the front, wiping away a wide patch of condensation from the window. What he saw made his breath catch, a convoy of semis, first one, then three, then nearly a dozen, slowly rolled into the lot, their headlights cutting through the remaining fog like searchlights, their engines growling against the hush of morning. Some bore familiar logos, others not. More trucks were lining up along the shoulder of the highway, waiting their turn to pull into the lot, their drivers stepping down and crunching across the packed snow in boots and thick jackets. James stepped outside, the icy air cutting through his shirt instantly, but he barely noticed Lindsay followed, wrapping her coat tighter around her. The drivers from the night before trailed close behind, blinking in disbelief. A man stepped forward from the lead rig, a rugged guy with a trimmed beard and a company jacket embroidered with the name Harrison Logistics. He extended a gloved hand. "Will Harrison," he said. "Heard what you did last night." Mr. Carter got a few folks together who thought that kind of decency deserves more than a thank you. Before James could respond, another figure stepped forward, a woman in a clean black coat with a clipboard tucked under her arm. "Gina Adams, Pioneer Freight Services." She said, "We coordinate regional deliveries along this corridor. If you're interested, we'd like to establish a formal stop here. Fuel meals, maybe even a small rest hub for our long-haul teams." James stood in stunned silence, struggling to process it all, but the moment wasn't done. Another man emerged from the crowd, older grey in the beard and holding something wrapped in a faded towel. "Back in 1997 outside Cheyenne, you lent me your backup CB radio," he said, voice thick with memory. "Kept me from freezing in a ditch. I've had it in my garage ever since. Figured it was time it came home." He unwrapped the device carefully, revealing the worn but still functional radio, the buttons faded, the cord frayed but unmistakably familiar. James reached for it with both hands, the metal cold against his palms, but somehow warm with meaning. He nodded, eyes glassy, as he held it to his chest like a medal. Behind him, the rest of the drivers began stepping forward one by one, offering more than words. One man handed James a sealed envelope, filled with donations collected from small companies and independent haulers who had heard what had happened. "They remember what it feels like when someone leaves the light on," he said, "and they want to make sure this place keeps burning." Another driver promised a monthly supply run of essentials. A woman from a West Coast fleet volunteered to feature Highway Haven in their driver network as a verified emergency rest stop. It wasn't just charity. These were partnerships respectful, mutual, rooted in a shared understanding that places like this mattered. James looked around him at the line of trucks, at the people gathered, despite the cold, at Lindsay, who wiped her eyes with the back of her sleeve and offered him a smile of disbelief and pride. The sun, finally rising, bathed the snowy lot in gold, the white drifts glowing with promise instead of punishment. James felt his knees weaken slightly, the magnitude of it all pressing in on him, but instead of collapsing, he found himself standing straighter. This wasn't a dream. It was a return, not just of business or fortune, but of connection. The road hadn't forgotten him. The drivers hadn't either. The kindness he had once given without expecting anything back had come home multiplied. Back inside, James placed the returned CB radio on its old base behind the counter. It clicked into place with a sound so crisp it echoed through the diner like a closing of a loop. Lindsay stood beside him, shaking her head in awe. "You really are a legend," she whispered. James didn't reply, just reached for the mic, turned the dial, and listened as static gave way to the faint voice of a driver far off on the road. "Breaker 19. Anyone got ears on Highway Haven?" James smiled, pressed the button, and answered with quiet certainty. "Highway Haven's here, and the light's still on." 1 year later, the harsh winter that once threatened to bury everything had long melted into memory, but the warmth it sparked inside Highway Haven Café had only grown brighter. From the outside, the transformation was undeniable. The snow-damaged roof had been replaced with a fresh shingle line, sturdy and clean. The faded signage was now reborn in bold red letters reading, "Highway Haven, a light for every traveler." The cracked parking lot had been repaved and expanded, now able to comfortably fit over 24 rigs. Floodlights lined the perimeter, staying on from dusk till dawn, guiding weary drivers in like a beacon. And just off to the side of the main building stood a brand-new trucker's lounge, equipped with clean showers, comfortable seating, a vending corner, and a small kitchenette. Donated by the very people James Carter had once helped, it had quickly become a haven within the haven. Inside the cafe, the soul of the place remained intact, but it was no longer cloaked in dust and silence. The old vinyl booths had been reupholstered in warm earth tones. The walls, once scuffed and faded, now wore a soft cream paint that reflected the golden morning light. But the creak of the old floorboards, the hum of the heater, and the familiar clang of coffee mugs still gave the space that same lived-in charm. Lindsay, now full-time, and managing the front with pride, kept things moving with grace and a sharp eye. James as ever worked the grill like it was an extension of his hands, but now with a quiet joy, no longer weighed down by the ghosts of yesterday. They didn't try to erase the past. Instead, they honored it, preserving old photos on a memory wall near the register where drivers often stop to point and share their own tales with newcomers. The regulars grew by the week. Truckers from as far as Oregon and Maine rerouted to include Highway Haven on their long-haul schedules. Some came for the food still made from scratch, hearty and hot. Others came for the community, the sense that in this little cafe off a quiet Kansas highway, they weren't just customers, they were family. The diner had become more than a stop. It was a ritual, a place where drivers knew they could find more than just a meal, they could find belonging. Every now and then, one of them would bring a gift, a handmade mug, an old CB part, a road map from a forgotten decade. These tokens lined the shelves above the counter, surrounding James as he worked with silent appreciation for the life he had been given back. Stories still flowed, just as they had that night during the storm. Caleb, the rookie who had once trembled over a cup of coffee, now had 2 years under his belt and was training younger drivers. He brought them to Highway Haven like it was part of their initiation. Sam, who had led the convoy that morning after the blizzard, stopped in whenever his route allowed, always greeting James with a firm handshake and a grin. Even Gina Adams from Pioneer Freight became a familiar sight, using the cafe as a meeting point for her teams. And every night before locking up, James would stand at the door, look out at the open highway bathed in the orange glow of the lot lights, and smile to himself because the cafe that once stood on the edge of despair now stood tall as a symbol of endurance, compassion, and the unseen ripple of kindness. And through it all, the old CB radio behind the counter remained exactly where it had always been. Its casing was polished. Now the antenna replaced the knobs cleaned, but it still crackled to life at random intervals, picking up the far-off voices of the road. Sometimes it was just static. Sometimes it was a joke passed between trucks, a warning about ice ahead, or a birthday shout-out to a driver named Bill on mile marker 83. But once in a while someone would call out into the vast silence of the airwaves, not expecting an answer. And when that happened, James would reach for the mic, lean in slowly, and let the warmth in his voice travel across the miles Highway Haven's here and the lights still on. Because for James Carter, the diner had never been just about coffee or meals or bottom lines. It had always been about people, about showing up when it mattered, standing tall when others couldn't, and keeping the light burning just in case someone out there still needed it. The miracle wasn't the money or the contracts or even the survival of the cafe. The miracle was the legacy etched into every creak of the floorboards, every sizzle from the griddle, and every voice that answered back on the open road. Highway Haven had been reborn, and now it would never be alone again. If this story moved you, inspired you, or reminded you of the quiet power of kindness, don't let it end here. Join the community at Deep Inside HQ by hitting the like button, subscribing to our channel, and turning on the notification bell so you never miss a story that stirs the soul. Share this video with someone who believes in second chances, in the strength of human connection, and in the magic of places like Highway Haven. Your support helps us continue to tell real, heartfelt stories that reveal the beauty in ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Stay with us, there's so much more to uncover.